Hello everyone. As you can see from the description of this video, my classmate Mayra Yesenia Perez Arista and I, Carolina Mireles Encarnacion, will present not only the translation of the fragment of the novel written by the author Virginia Woolf, but also will present some processes, decisions making, and techniques that were necessary to use during the process of this translation and that corresponds to a literal translation like calco and literal translation as a procedure. In addition to the oblique translation as modulation, transposition, just to mention a few. In addition to the difficulties and type of problems that we face during the translation process. So, with nothing more to add, we begin.
Before starting with the translation of this effort, we first consider talking about the author, that is, the year of publication, historical and social context in which the literary text is inserted. Other than Virginia Stevens, better known as Virginia Woolf, she was born in Kingston, UK on January 25, 1882. She was a British writer, author of novels, short stories, plays, and other literary works. Considered one of the most prominent figures of the 20th century in whose literary artistic trend is avant-garde. On the other hand, as part of his most famous work is a novel which we will talk about below, in which is titled Mr. Dalloway, 1925. Now, as part of the scope of our objectives, a fragment of the novel Mr. Dalloway by the author Virginia Woolf was translated from English to Mexican Spanish. Our target audience corresponds to bachelor level students in the teaching and learning of English in secondary education. It should be noted that before starting the translation process, it was necessary to identify what type of text it was, since according to Saussure, before starting it is important to identify but the type of text to be translated, be it narrative or descriptive, as well as its functions.
Okay, so now, as you can see, according to our linguistic analysis, if we compare the original text with the target text, the number of words is 30% more extensive than the original text. And this is because, although it is true that there are similarities between languages, there are also differences, such as arbitrariness, and an example of this is the syntactic functioning and grammatical structure. That is to say, the arrangement of words and the order. For example, and to understand better, if in English we can notice the presence of the subject before the verb, as well as the adjectives.
Likewise, part of the differential feature that exists in the translation from English to Mexican Spanish is in the repetitive use of the case of English or participants, demonstrative gerunds, adverbs, etc. Well, unlike Spanish, since if it were done in the same way, the output text will lose question in the discourse. On the other hand, according to the problems we faced during the translation process, they were mainly understanding what the author was trying to convey to the public and then understanding and knowing how to interpret the text. Remember that the translator's job is to preserve not only the form but also the meaning of the source text to the target text.
That said, one of the textual problems we faced during the translation was due the use of some words and meaning. For example, for the phrase her work cut out for her, which appears on the third paragraph, and of which making a literal translation simply didn't make sense. So we decided to make an equivalence and then decide that the phrase will be translated as tenía mucho trabajo por hacer. As for the word scrap parvis and Peter Walsh, we decide to make use of a préstamo or borrowing, since there was a linguistic gap in the target language. With respect to the word curb, we decide to make a literal translation, so that its mean will be then acera. But taking into account our context as well as the target audience for this translation, when we're looking for a synonym for acera, we was agreed that the word banqueta could be understood by the audience, since in this sense, we as translators always intend to approach the reader instead than the reader approaching the translator.
According to what I saw during the translation part 1 and 2, I can recognize the work of the translator, considering that it is very important for my teaching work as a student to know how to differentiate the procedure used to know the difference between a literal and oblique translation, and everything what it implies to preserve not only the form but also the meaning of the source text to the target text, and that's all.
Finally, and as part of my conclusion, and what I learned during this course of translation 1 and 2 was that the translation process is the activity of understanding the meaning of a text in one language, called original text, to produce a text with equivalent meaning in another language, called a target text. Likewise, in translation, there are three elements that come into play. For example, the author, the translator, and the reader, each with some different characteristics and responsibilities. At the same way, to carry out the translation process, it is important to know first the contribution of translation theory, to have a reference and not fall in the error of inexperienced translators, since it is true that it's not only necessary to be an expert of the source language, but also to know the procedures, techniques behind the translation, in order to preserve the coherence between the original text and the target text.